control down arrow, it takes me to the bottommost row in Excel. And then if you see on the top left here, it says 1048576. So that's 1,048,000 rows. So control up arrow takes me back again to the topmost row. Control right arrow takes me to the next populated cell. And if I keep doing control right arrow, it'll take me to the furthest column on Excel. So it's good to know to navigate, data using this control key and the up and down arrow, left and right arrows. And control A, so if, let's say this is a table of data with column headings and populated with information. So if I click on any cell and I say Control A, by default, it selects all the data in the table. If I do the Control A one more time, it selects even the column header. So again, this is a useful shortcut. So if I do Control A again, and if I do Control T, that means that I make the data as a table. A table format is really good because by default, it applies filters, like this. So you can sort data without having to worry about losing, if the rows are getting jumbled on, affecting your data. So I think I always use a table format. So any data, let's say this is, I've got 3 rows and 3 columns. So I can do Control T, and then it brings me this dialog box, and then it already says my table has headers. Then I say, okay, so that means it is a table nomenclature. And the advantage of that is, like I said earlier, you can use formulas using column headers. So instead of saying, multiply A3 by B4, you will actually know what it is that you're multiplying. So for example, so here in B2, so I've got some formula there, and it says I'm doing something to the time of sampling, which is the cell to the left, and then I'm subtracting A2. I'll come in a minute what the dollar signs mean. So you can, so rather than saying A2, I'm actually writing it as time of sampling, which is the column header. So it's really good for writing formulas. Let's say here, some 0.5 is a sample volume in a dilution factor, what it is, the calculations that I'm doing, and thanks to the table format, so that this is possible. And if I want to edit a formula, so I can do F2, so I can then use the left arrow key. You can scroll, back and forth, and escape to come back. F9 is to evaluate. So you can evaluate parts of formula. So you can highlight, let's say, just this in one. If I do F9, so it'll tell me what that value is. And you can see it says 43,971 something. And the reason being, Excel sees the date, which is in A2, as a number, because for Excel, the date begins from 1900, if I'm not mistaken. So anything before 1900, it just doesn't recognize. So since 1900, how many days have passed? So that's 43,000 days. And then the 0.375 is because Excel calculates, this 9 hours. So 9 divided by 24, it's 0.375 fraction of a day. So that's how Excel, day starts from 0 at midnight, ends at 24 hours or 11:59 so that will be 1. So and then the values would be between 0 and 1 for any fraction of the day. So this would be important when I said in a time of sampling, when you do a fermentation. So this is today's date, and then I always enter date like this. So put the date followed by the time in hour, in a colon, minutes, and then you can write this formula using the column headers. And then you can multiply by 24 to give what fraction of the day it is, in terms of hours that I'm at that sample point. So let's go to the second sample point, which is at 11 hours, and we know it's 2 hours. And the way Excel does it is, so you can highlight these two into F9, say 0.08 fraction of a day, and then if I multiply it by 24 hours, then I get 2. Right, so I think this would be a very useful tip for when we do fermentations. I mean, probably you won't maybe do it at some point. And then OD, measurements, sample volume, because whenever you take a sample, you dilute the sample to read the absorbance in the spectrophotometer. And I think, I don't know for bacteria, for yeast, I always dilute when the reading goes above 0.4. So you can actually say how much volume that you take from the micropipette, say if it is 0.5, and how much volume did you top it up with for a final volume. So you can, so every step, you can actually write it down. So you can calculate the dilution factor, which is the total volume divided by the sample volume. So that's the total volume being this. I can do F9, so that's 1, sample volume, so that's a dilution factor of 2, and then the actual what is this. And then you can see here I use the product functions because Excel has got lots of functions. So instead of saying multiply this by this, I also use product function to for multiplying numbers. Right. So that's just a bit about the tables. And when I say this control, so this sign here, control, whatever that sign is, it's like an apostrophe. So if I do control, it's on my key in the top left. So I can see all the formulas that is in this worksheet. And that's a very useful tip because you don't know which cell is populated with the formula. And you can also evaluate a formula using this Alt-Tough. So let's say any cell which has a formula, I can do Alt-Tough. So I can go and evaluate one step at a time to find out, what are all the calculations that has been happening in that particular. And Control 1 is another a very good, very useful because it brings up the format window, so you can format the cells in whatever format you want. And what else? Control F3. So that's the name manager. You can name any cell with a text. So I'll give you some examples here. And yes, and then the F4 key is to toggle between absolute and relative referencing. So I'll come in a minute in the next sheet. Right, that's for the shortcuts. And often, in microbiology, in bacterial physiology, we want to calculate the maximum specific growth rate, or when you do a standard curve for concentration versus OD, so you may want to calculate the slope of the curve, how many OD units per milligrams per liter of your sample, standard concentration. So I use again the slope function in Excel. So rather than making a plot and then going into add a trend line, like you normally do, the slope function allows me to, you can highlight what you want to, which data points you want to do. So you can say known Y, known X, and I can even round it off automatically. So that's very commonly used. And the advantage being, so you can now reference this. Let's say you want to do a calculation with the slope. So I can name this 0.37 as specific growth rate. So I can do that by, this is in K3. So I can just go to the top left and I can say specific growth underscore, so, and then say, so now if I write equals specific growth rate, so it will be referring to that particular cell. I change this, let's say, to 0.5, so automatically this will change to 0.5 as well. So any cell which has this, and it just makes calculations easier. Otherwise, you've got to go and each cell change, a few more clicks. It's not the end of the world. And then the R square value, you normally get it from the graph. This is the graph that I use. So 0.37 here. This is 0.37 shows on the graph. And then 0.99, which is again the RSQ function. So that's the doubling time is 0.693 divided by specific growth rate. So you can calculate what's the doubling time in hours. So that's a very useful way to work with Excel. So if you know the table nomenclature, so you know what each value is rather than F2 and C2 and so on and so forth. All right, so go to the next one, which is the relative referencing. So for that, I think I'll take this one, the multiplication table. Again, if you know this, it's really good. If you don't, I think you will really appreciate the power of Excel. Multiplication, we all know it's, this is top is 1 to 9 here, 1 to 9, and I want to multiply by using just one formula. And let's build it together. So let's say I want to multiply this, the left, with the top. And I say Control Enter, so my cursor stays within the same cell. And if I just drag it along to the left, drag it to the bottom, and you see we get some rubbish values, right? So something is going wrong here. So so the reason is this is what the relative referencing comes in. So when you go from cell B3, so when you go from C3 to D3, you're still referring to the cell B3, right? So that means we need to lock the column. So no matter where you are in the further right in the columns, so the column B has to be locked. And that you do it using this F4 function key. So I can use the F4 to toggle and that locks if there is a $sign before B, that means the B column is locked. So let's now just Control Enter, and it's still not right? Across, when I go from left to right, the formula seems to be working fine, but top to bottom, something is not right. So, so let's now go to the C2. So from C2, when I go to the D2, that should be fine. But then when I go from the top to bottom, I should always stay in the row 2. And that by, again, using the locking the second row, if I do that, now we get the correct formula. So this is the correct placing of the $signs, and that you can do using the F4 key, which is the shortcut for absolute or relative referencing. So if you want to lock a cell completely, you will put in $sign for the rows as well as for the column. Right. Moving on to the next sheet, because this is with the dry mass calculations, because I have seen some examples where, you've got triplicates, and this is from my data set, and I've got duplicate values, and again, using a table nomenclature, so you know what is being subtracted and so on. And here it's only duplicates, right, because I only have 2 values, not 3. So even though you can do standard deviation with 2 values, so I've seen in papers where they write average plus minus deviation from the mean. And for that, I've used the power of Excel's formula, which is the if function, to populate the deviation from the mean. So all I want is, so this is the average cell concentration calculated from these 2 dry cell concentration, and I wanted to write a formula which will give me what is the deviation of this from the average. And I wrote this by using this formula, which is if. So if function has got true and false, so it does something, and then so that's the logical test. So based on this, it does something. If it is true, it does something. If it is not true, it will do something else. So what is happening here is, so we can evaluate part of that. So F2 not equal to null. So if I evaluate that is a true, that means F2 is not true because it's 9.9. What do I want it to do? So I wanted to get the the average minus the dry cell concentration, and that's what it does here, and it populates it here. And then I can just double click it down. The second one here, so is this not equal to null? It's false, so it will go into this, the second logical, the answer to the logical test, which is false. That means it will be a null value here. So you don't have to have an error because there's no value here. So instead of getting an error, it just looks visually appealing by using this if function to populate it down. And this plus minus, because sometimes you might have seen, so rather than you putting the plus minus manually, so you can use again the Excel's text function to add using this concatenate feature to get these right. So you've got this sheet. I know it's very quick. You can try it using this control. This apostrophe on the top left to see what is actually happening in a particular cell. So I have seen examples here. For example, here it says a plus. You don't have to put a plus when you write a formula. And here right away I'll do Control A, Control T to make it as a table. So it'll automatically add all the filters to make it very easy to sort, because it'll come in very handy, because I can now here say, come to this place here and then go into the blanks. Now I've got a shortened version of all the time points and the dry masses and the individual averaged values. So I can just copy the whole thing and then place it into a new place, and I can do Control V, so just to be sure that any formulas are not carried over. So if you do Control this one here, that's just the values, right? And again here there was one thing I noticed. I think two people have used standard deviation .p as the formula, while it should be yes actually, because it is the sample, not the population, that is being used to calculate the deviation. And yeah, this is an example where you see the formulas are being, the values are being hard coded into the cells. So again, this can be avoided by having the standard curve plotted using this particular method, where you can highlight which rows the concentration and the OD are there, and then you get the slope, and then you can then say multiply this by, let's say, a specific growth rate, and normally intercept for standard curves should be 0, because at concentration 0, the OD should be 0. So then you can write the formula like that. And tomorrow, if you've got another standard curve, it'll automatically update. Right. So I think that's what I had for Excel. So I think now it's good. It's like 25 minutes for Excel. You may know all of these. But if something is new, then it's good. So there are two ways of getting data to GraphPad. So you can have the Excel file open, and you can copy, and then you can use this, let's say if I take this value, Control-C, and I can come here and then right-click, paste special, and it'll ask me what I want to do. So it's a insert and maintain link. So if I do that, it'll actually refer to the source file in Excel. So you can do it that way, but I have here hard-coded, meaning I do all my work in Excel and then I copy-paste the actual values in GraphPad. So when you create a new project, so you have a project file, and then it'll ask you what sort of a data you want to enter. So here at the moment it's a XY, so you can have various types of data. I think with Carolyn, you may have done grouped column, because that's what I think you use normally for plotting viability data. So we've got time and OD and concentrations. We choose XY. So So you can either have the data entered directly here, so in which case you can put in, enter 3 replicates, or you can have the mean and the standard deviation calculated in Excel, and then you can say OK, and then it will create columns automatically for you. So I've copy-pasted the values for the mean and standard deviation and the times, so that will be on the top. And the moment I do that, GraphPad automatically plots all this for me without me doing anything, and that's really good, because in Excel you've got to do an awful lot before you can get a plot. So that's a very good feature here. So let's so that'll be in here. The stacked version that I shown, something like this. It all starts with that first data file. So what I have done is, so I just duplicate this particular sheet. So I can duplicate that, and then I can rename it to anything that you want. And then let's say duplicate current sheet, copy of data 1. So we can call that as call it as a data 1 actually, and then I can come here and double click that, and so it says data sets and graph, so I can remove all of them by holding the shift and just left clicking, and then I can remove all of them and just keep one of them as the data to show, because I wanted to make let's say a graph, something like that. And you do that for all of them, so you copy paste the data 1 into a second, rename it, and then you double click, go to the data set, and choose the one that you haven't chosen before. This is how I have done it. Maybe there is another way, but you can see here glucose, nitrogen, OD. So I've got all of these values, and you can also see that I have also offsetted the axes. And the way you can do that is, when I just hover the cursor over the axes, and I can double click that, and it will bring me a dialog box, and you can go to frame and origin, and you can see in this frame style, you can go into offset X and Y axes, and I've done that. You can also show which axes you want to, because at the moment both the axes are shown, but there are graphs where, for example here, because I'm making a stacked graph, so I have removed the y-axis. So I did that again, like that, going to the axis, hovering it over, you say hide x, show y, so you have various options for showing the axes. So I did that for all of them. Right, and then if you wanted to keep, let's say, this particular format, and this is, you have formatted one graph to your heart's content, and you can go into this magic wand, and that's a fantastic tool. So you can make all the graphs consistent, as it says here, make graphs consistent. So you can choose that. So let's say I want to make the pH graph like the one for DOT. So go into the magic wand. So it says here you've already selected the graph that will be changed. Now choose the graph you want to serve as an example. So I want to serve, let's say, the OD graph as the template for making the change. So I go into next, and then so you will see what change would be replicated. So this is a good way to reduce the repetitive tasks for multiple graphs. So once you've got that, you can have a layout. So if let's say and I want to have a graph, 1 across by 3 down. So let's say that, or actually, let's do. So I can go and let's put that one OD, no, maybe pH, and then maybe DOT here. So I've got 3 graphs now in one. So I can Control A, so select everything, and I can right click, equalize scaling factors. So reduce it to the maximum or even decrease it, to any you want. And then I can align all of them, the y-axis, so that all the axes are aligned to the left. And so now you can, move, let's say, them very close. So you don't need this particular right time in hours. So we need to remove that in all of them. So you can move them very close. So you can select all of them, and you can copy, and then, or you can also right-click, copy layout. You can go to, let's say, quotes. So you can go and say paste. So it actually pastes the original GraphPad linked figure. So if I double click that, so it'll take me back to GraphPad. I think this is also what David mentioned in one of these earlier meetings, I think, because you can make changes here. Let's say I wanted to remove the time in the pH. So let's go to pH, remove this here, and file. And then I come back to, I need to come back to layout 4 and file, update document 1, file, close and return to document 1. So now it actually has replicated the change that I did and then brought it back to the Word document. So that's, I think, really good if you want to go back and forth between Word and GraphPad. And I'm sure Origin and Sigmaplot have them as well. Right, I think that's the layout. So you can have, as I said, across in 2 columns or just 1 row, multiple columns. So you can see some of the versions here. This is the version that I've used in all my publications. You can have colors, various, and for the 2 axes here, this is a graph with the 2y. But again, let's say any data point, you can right click and you can say plot data on left, right, and that's how you can choose. And then it adds you the title, saying add y title, and then you can offset. So this is with 2y, and then for multiple y, where we have you've got to do some tricks because it's not so straightforward. So for that, I took, let's say, OD2, data 2. So this is the OD, imagining that I want to have OD as a tertiary axis because it goes up to 15. So I have that data separately in a project file. And then a new data would be created. I make copies of that, and then in the copy, I'll see here in the data 2, I've removed the axes, so by hiding both y and x. And then in the second one, I've hidden the data because you can just say, by so you can right-click, remove data set from graph. I think that's what I've done here. So then you just keep the y-axis, and then you'll do a layout, which will be something like that. So it is 3. You can see all of them are, multiple graphs. You've got 3, and then you can overlay them after you equalize with x-axis aligned, and then you get a graph that will be something like running. So I didn't, look into the what is it? The axes. Yes. Anyway, so that's you do that for multiple. If you've got have a 4th y-axis, then you do the same thing, making a copy paste of just that data set. If it is dissolved oxygen you want to do, so you go into a new plot data, create, call that dissolved oxygen, given the data, and make the plot, copy, duplicate current sheet, and then here remove data set and do exactly like I did for data 2, and then put in a layout, and then you can have multiple graphs in one, right? Something like this can be produced. Right, I think that's what I had for GraphPad. So it was pretty quick, sorry if it was a bit rushed. And I've got the resources here, in this the text file. So you have this particular video just came out 2 days ago. This is a very good channel that I follow. And in fact, Excel is Fun. This is a channel from which I self-taught Excel in 2010. He's an educator in the US. Fantastic videos on Excel. And then for GraphPad, for 3 y-axis, this is from the GraphPad website. And then and this is a YouTube channel from a senior lecturer from King's College actually, of senior lecturer in physiology. And again, very good tutorials on statistical analysis or column graphs, how to add this asterisk or to show that the data is significant. So you've got all this by email and you've got the raw data. So, and I think hopefully you're well equipped with this plotting and the analysis. I haven't mentioned anything about in terms of what is the yield, what is the titer, but maybe that will happen another time because we haven't looked at the glucose concentration, we haven't looked at nitrogen concentration, but I suppose we'll do that another time. Yeah, I think that's all I have. These two are really good because sometimes, if let's say if I enter a value and I put a space, because some people do, and then they put in, let's say, number 3. So if I say what the length is of that, and okay, it says it's 1, or you can have, let's say, text space. So it says the length is 6. So often, I've seen in places where people put in a space in a text, these two, is text and is number, is really good to know whether something is a number or a number which is actually a text.
Perfect.
And you can convert a text. Let's say I can, let's say number 4. So I can put an apostrophe like this, and it'll make it as a text. So if I say is number, and it'll say it's false, right? Because I have put in this apostrophe before, and many people do that for whatever reason. So I can change this to a number just by adding a mathematical, by doing a mathematical operation by, let's say, adding 0. So now I can say is number. Now it is a number because I have done this mathematical operation. So this is a useful trick. Sometimes, when you have a bad data, so you've got to do these to make it a bit good before you can work on it.